With me today is Pauli Undesser, the CEO of Water Quality Association. Pauli, I want to turn the mic over to you. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, your current role, and sort of the background of your career on what you've done at Water Quality Association.
Thank you so much, Lucas. As the CEO of the Water Quality Association, I have been in the role since 2017. I have been with the Water Quality Association for almost 17 years now, though. So I've moved through the ranks in different positions. I think CEO is now my 6th or 7th position, and I've been keeping all of my business cards from each of those, and I have them framed in my office. But prior to the Water Quality Association, I was in the biotech industry, and I was a research scientist in a laboratory. And after several years of driving 3 hours a day to get to and from work and having 3 kids, I decided I needed to change industries and do something different. But I wanted to stay technical. I wanted to have the ability to move up within the organization, and the Water Quality Association was a great place to go. So I started out in the technical capacities, and over 17 years moved into more business side and learning about associations along the way.
We had chatted a little bit before the show. I had said that I think that's unique that you've been there sort of on the ground doing the research that's related to your industry. You understand the science and technology behind all of the work that you're doing and your members are doing. How has that benefited you in your current role?
For me, the biggest benefit is I certainly relate to a very technical membership. And the respect that I get for that is, I think, very highly regarded across the industry, that I can be a speaker, not only from a business perspective, but also from the science and technology side. Great example, I was just on Capitol Hill doing a Senate hearing, and I was able to talk to whether it was the consumer and public perceptions around everything, the business impacts, as well as what was the technical issues that we were up against. So it's great to be able to lean on all of those as a CEO.
I really think there is a strong benefit there to be able to sort of talk the talk and walk the walk and understand all levels of what's happening and be able to speak to the technical sides of it. Again, at the member level, at the policy level, on the staff level. Do you often find yourself going back into the laboratory and speaking with those folks like day to day?
I love talking with everybody across the organization, but certainly we just relocated and built a whole new laboratory out in the last couple years. And that was probably one of the best projects that I've done, where I could really lean on the business side of how do we do it efficiently, effectively, and do business better. But I got to get into the nuts and bolts of how are we doing the testing and working with our lab manager and director on that. And so it was a fun project. It was really taxing trying to do that during a global pandemic and supply chain issues and everything else that came along with it. But it was one of the best projects that I could lean on all of my skills and expertise.
I think the timing of that is interesting also. We didn't talk about that, but during the global pandemic, there were a lot of associations, trade and professional, who were pulling back. Even this year, there was a lot of talk about, is there something coming later this year? What do we need to, we kind of need to tighten the belt a little bit just in case, right? There's a backlash or the inflation piece kicks in a stronger sense than we anticipated. And at the same time, they're pulling on reserves and trying to figure out new senses of revenue. And here you are, going full into let's build a whole new laboratory, right? There's an investment cost, there's a time and resource cost. And I know you're big on innovation and driving. You're an organization that has an innovation title on your leadership staff. Was this an innovation? This is just you really wanting to do this? And what are some of the drivers around wanting to do that specifically now?
Yeah. So for me, form follows function in everything that we do. So we have been doing innovation and creative thinking for probably 10 years or more within the organization. And how do we continuously reinvent the organization, reinvent ourselves as leaders? And we have been building it into every part of the organization so that it's not just one person, one title. So even though that's what we created this year, that individual as a vice president of innovation is working across the organization, making sure it's in strategy, it's in operations, it's everything we do. And we have two other positions that do things similarly for external affairs and our global services, just making sure that we're not working in a silo for it, but we're really integrating it into everything.
I think that's great. I mean, some people would say innovation, we're just talking about our systems and AI and all of that. So can you talk a little bit more about how the innovation role, the vice president role, touches some of those other areas, like more specifically?
Yeah. So a couple examples. Every year for, I think, the last 8 to 10 years, we've been doing a brainstorming across all staff before we go into budgeting and operations planning for the next year. And what we're looking for are the ideas across anyone in the organization that has an extra revenue driver, or how can we cut expenses and still deliver the same value? So every year we do that. And even in the last couple years, we have reinvented what that looks like so that it doesn't get stale, it doesn't get old, but that we continuously get value added that way. Another example is when we talk about creating a cross-functional team. So anytime we're going to redesign something, so like our laboratory, when we went to redesign our laboratory, most people would say, well, we need a cross-functional team across the laboratory functions, right? And that the people involved are there. We made sure we had somebody from our membership team. There was somebody that was completely outside that had never even stepped into a laboratory before. We had folks that were in 3 different perspectives, the staff person going through it, a client going through it, and what about a product going through? So we had people that actually kind of wore their hats as different perspectives going through the whole design. So when we talk about, cross-functional or diverse planning, we really look at every part of your mindset that you bring to it, not just kind of the position or title you have.
So 2 things in there that really resonate with me and that I'm a real believer in is, one, sort of the breaking down of the silos, right? So the idea of getting everybody to cross-functionally have conversations about how what you're doing in membership impacts other areas and vice versa, right? So I have to understand my role within the organization and how it's part of the greater machine, if you will, because one, it helps me understand how everything works together. And I think is motivating as a leader when you can implement that sort of breaking down the silos. And then 2, that you go around and you get the input from everybody. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has the best idea, and you don't know unless you ask, because as you know, there's just not everybody's ready and willing in the front row to raise their hand and say what they have to say. And sometimes the brilliance is hiding in the shadows, as they say.
Absolutely. And not everybody likes to share, like you said, in the same way. So we do try to integrate different methods that match different types of individuals. So there could be the submit your entry in a written way versus the folks that want to talk it out and banter and have great brainstorming. And then there's others that are like, okay, I want to design something and create it with my hands and not just verbally. So I need to create it and give it to you. And so we try to do things in different ways to bring out the strengths in individuals in the way that matches them.
So do you actually solicit that information regularly? Like, is there a way within your organization that somebody can easily create sort of a private digital submission to the suggestion box, or do you reach out on some regular cadence? How do you work that into the culture?
Yep. The last couple of years, we did have an actual virtual suggestion box. It wasn't utilized as much as we had hoped, so we gave up on that one, and now we're reinventing that process of how do we solicit. So right now, through the end of the year, I have a team that are working on what does it look like in December and January to set up a whole new brainstorming and what might that look like. So I really don't know what it's going to look like. I'm not a leader to say this is the complete vision on this and I want to create it in X, Y, and Z. Yeah. I'll give the boundaries and guardrails and say, go create what we need to get this outcome. And so that's what they're working on now. So I'll be excited to see what gets put together.
Yeah, that is exciting. Keep us posted. Um, So the other thing is going back to the laboratory, those things, it takes a really strong relationship, in my opinion, with the board to be able to sort of make those type of bigger moves. You've been on a couple of boards. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your motivation for wanting to join some boards and some things that have benefited you from that. One of the things I know you shared with me was being on the board helps you understand sort of sitting on the other side of the table, what you would look for. And has that sort of benefited you not only in the laboratories, but in other areas?
Yeah, so I consider myself not just a lifelong learner, but a lifelong reinventor. And so looking to be on an external board for me was, how do I put myself in somebody else's shoes so that I might transform and reinvent how I look at boards? And I would say it's done that. It certainly helps me to see, where are the questions valuable that I would ask as a board member versus what is the information that's coming at me, and is that valuable to me? So there was a lot of value questions in my head back and forth, which then I brought back to my own boards of asking, am I providing the right value, and am I making sure they have space to ask the questions that are valuable, and vice versa. So for our laboratory, there's a really big connection with board understanding the drivers of the laboratory, because not all of them are scientists. They're business leaders, right? And so to understand that there's value in a laboratory, but how does that translate to what you're doing at the board, is a really big conversation that we have. And I think me being on an external board helped me to put that in perspective of what do they need to know? How much do they need to know? We don't need to get into the nuts and bolts of it, but there still needs to be an appreciation and a value there. And how does that come across?
Yeah, that communication and understanding how you present that, I think, is really important, and a driver why I would want to be on those boards as well. That's completely makes sense. And so one of the boards you're on, Association Forum, I get that. That's the Chicago base. It's local. There's lots of associations, great networking, I assume, as well. And then the other is HR Source. So tell us a little bit, like, where's the connection on HR Source, why that particular board maybe, and what have you learned from being within and around those organizations?
Yeah. So HR Source certainly was very intriguing to me, because they supply basically human resources, information, and education out to a lot of different industries. Some of them are manufacturing based, some are libraries, and others are associations. Mm-hmm. And I really like the diversity of it, especially since my membership is manufacturing and it's dealers. And so they have different perspectives. So being on an external board that gave me even more perspectives to look at, opportunities and challenges, I thought would just make me a stronger leader, not only for HR Source, but for my own organization as well.
Kind of switching gears, we also talked a little bit about your passion for coaching and for leadership. And you mentioned you're a lifelong learner, a lifelong innovator. Tell us a little bit about why coaching and what that looks like for you.
Yeah. So I started being a mentor for others in high school. It just seemed something natural that, folks would seek me out, because I was, one, able to digest things in simple ways, but two, I'll bring up this term that I was a badass, and I was able to tell you straight what you needed to hear, and that what many either teachers or maybe family members weren't portraying it in that straightforward way of, hey, if you're not doing the work, you need to do it, or whatever it was. So I started this just strong desire to continue being a mentor very early on. And as I continued, I found that being a mentee myself, I learned a lot. And so whether I'm on the mentor side or the mentee, I feel like there's mutual benefit. So today I usually have anywhere between 3 and 5 mentees that I will have at any one time. And I most enjoy coaching on leadership development, executive development. Just how do you explore what your gifts are as a leader, and how do you make sure that you're leaning into them, but you're always learning more, right? You're always reinventing,
Yeah.
transforming, but don't lose what your true gifts are, because they're going to take you really far.
I think that first of all, that's amazing that you were a high school badass and you were the original truth teller, if you will, to people. We talk a lot about that within the organization of being your sort of gracious candor, right? You have to be able to speak the truth. It doesn't have to be mean or ugly but you have to be able to give them the feedback that they need to hear. Maybe not always that they want to hear, but that's really important. And I assume, talk a little bit about your culture. Is that woven into your own individual culture at Water Quality? You said you mentee some of the people within the organization. I think that's really interesting as well, that you've selected those. And then you're open, I assume, to the feedback from your own mentors when they give you that gracious candor, if you will.
Yeah. So within the organization, I set up an operating guidelines many years ago from a mentor to myself who had introduced it. And in those operating guidelines, we pretty much set up with what most people may seem that's common sense, right? Do you really have to write it down or say it? Yes. You have to write it down and say it, because if you don't, you may have new people. It's their first job ever, and they may have different expectations from somewhere else. So the expectations we have are on what's the mindset you should bring to work every day, the crucial conversations you should have on an individual level before they would ever escalate. If they needed to escalate, what is that process? How does that happen? And then we talk about decision making and making sure that we empower as many people to make decisions at the level they need to. They don't always have to go up the ladder and back down the ladder. So we set those pretty clearly. And when it comes to mentoring and being a mentee, that feedback is always bi-directional. So we build that into not only our mentoring program, which we're launching this fall, but also our performance assessments. It's one of the 5 things that we put on there is that you should give your manager feedback and you should expect feedback. And we derive that because we want to be feedback rich and try to really dispel some of the stigmas around feedback that some folks feel like it's always criticism or critical, and it doesn't have to be. It's how you learn and grow.
Yeah. Well, so the mentor program, are you able to share? I mean, you say it's coming up, it's launching this fall. Are you able to share some of the details and why this program, right? Time is precious. And so you're choosing to allocate some of your own and staff resources to this. Why was it important to you? And what does that program look like?
Yeah. As a leader, to me, cultural excellence is as meaningful as operational excellence. So this year, we're really setting how do we balance those. Over the last 8 to 10 years, we've been doing a lot of growth on the cultural excellence and cleaning up the operational excellence. And now we're at a really good place of how do we find that great balance where you have this wonderful synergy between operations and culture. Mentoring is one that we launched a program externally for our members a few years ago. And we really liked the components of it. And my staff had been asking for how do we get a mentoring program? So we basically took what we did externally and then we made it ours. We made it what would work for us. And how do we make sure that the mentors have a baseline training, which is starting with me having a mentoring circle with the mentors. And then it'll launch out to go into the mentees here in the next couple of months. But certainly we're really excited about it because of that. It'll help us make sure we continue that balance of culture and operations.
Absolutely. I like the idea of the balance. And it clearly must have been an attractive program if your own staff are asking, hey, can we get some of this? So the members must have been something that was high value, high worth, and worth the investment. I wanted to ask you this question. I don't mean to couple it with like the mentor program necessarily and the culture piece, but are you willing to share a mistake that you've made? I think it's important that, we all make mistakes. I tell people like on calls, I got a lot of scars from all the mistakes from like falling down and getting back up. Because when you fall, you get scraped, you get scars, it happens. So I'm open to that. And I like to leave a little room for the reflection piece. So I learned, okay, step up and step over. So I don't make that one again. But are you willing to share a mistake that you've made and maybe what you've learned from that?
Absolutely. From driving culture in the organization, I find that being as transparent and authentic of a leader, I know it may sound cliche, but it's really true and honest, that the more you can relate to your staff and have those honest conversations, the better. So for me, when it comes to what is a mistake, I make them all the time. I own up to them all the time. And I always talk about fail fast, right? But one of the biggest ones that happened recently, we talked about, we had the global pandemic. We did a relocation during that time, all the economic pressures that happen along with that. I really ended up leaning into my badass self during that time a lot. And that's not the mistake, but I really undertook what seemed like impossible activities or really accomplishing all of these impressive things, which I know many did. And I came across and convinced myself I could handle anything, right? I was pushing through everything.
Bulletproof, right.
Right. What was happening at the same time, though, which was hidden in a blind spot, and I knew this was happening, but there was this big blind spot that I didn't check, and that's my mistake. But I was dealing with chronic pain. I had extreme grief from the loss of 17 individuals in my life in a year and a half. And I was burnt out from all of the badass things I was doing. But yet the impact on me physically, mentally, and emotionally was what was hidden in that blind spot, because I was just running over life with my badass self.
Yeah.
I never checked my blind spot until my body finally shut me down. And basically my body was like, yeah, you're not going to go forward anymore. And you need to take care of this badass self that's falling apart here. So
even badasses need self-care.
They do, but most badasses won't take the time to do that because you're a badass, right?
Right.
You can't do that, and so it's certainly something that there's a lot of lessons learned in there. And as a scientist, researcher, that's CEO, wife, mom, I've put a lot of reflection and investigation into it. And I'm actually in the works of writing a book called The Blind Spot of Badassery. And it's about the life-saving discoveries of a scientist and CEO. And I'm really passionate and excited about it. And we'll see when we finish and how it gets published, but really excited.
Well, I'm sure it's going to be great. And first of all, that's the most badass title I've ever heard. So I'm already looking forward to reading that when that one comes out. I'm curious now, like having heard that, like how does that change your approach to staff culture? Do you do anything differently? Are you more of an advocate or a champion for self-care, and what does that look like if so?
Yeah. I always was a great advocate for self-care. I gave permission all the time. And one of my biggest reflections, though, that's in that mistake bucket as well, is I thought I was living self-care and by giving permission and talking about it and taking vacation. But it really was this superficial self-care, and there's so much more to it. And so absolutely, I am much stronger into how do we do that. We actually started operational and cultural excellence days once a month, and a lot of the culture items that we focus on are self-care. Actually, this week is National Grief Awareness Day on August 30th. And so I'm going to be doing some discussions of self-reflections, lesson learned on grief, because certainly I went through a lot of it, and many, many people have through the pandemic and beyond.
Absolutely. Well, that's a mistake I can share in. I've done that in times in my career, times in my life where I'm just going so hard and so fast, and nothing will faze me. Right, just run through the walls like a badass, as you said. And I worked through vacations, I worked weekends, I did all the things, and just kind of put on the front that like I was fine. And I told myself I was fine. And from the outside, it probably looked like I was fine, but I would run myself completely ragged, and then to the point where like, oh, I can't get up. I literally have to go to bed for 12 hours and for multiple days and get rest. So I think that's a common thing, and that's a mistake. Maybe we all have to make. I always like to think that people are learning something from these mistakes that we share, in the moment, for example, and go, I really need to take care of myself. And that's physically, I think that's mentally. There's a lot of aspects to self-care. And there are some stigmas around that sometimes, certainly from, I would say, the mental aspects of self-care that still exist, unfortunately. Getting that taken care of is really, really important. And I, too, encourage others to lean into that,
Yeah.
unfortunately, more than I do myself. So.
I'm so glad that you do, and that you brought up stigmas, because I think that is the biggest reason a lot of leaders don't talk about those challenges, and they just lean in on, being a badass is a great thing and it's something to be celebrated. But certainly the stigmas of talking about the blind spot or what might be there that even you are aware of, that's really tough. So actually this weekend, I was looking up stigma, and I realized that there's so much more to it than what I ever knew. So as a self-reinventor, I decided that I'm going to put my own mission to myself for the end of the year, which I call it the mission stigma-free. And I'm going to learn as much as I can about stigmas and how can I help my own awareness and awareness of others between now and the end of the year about how do we end stigmas, because I think so many could really benefit from it.
What are some of the top stigmas that you kind of want to approach and maybe learn more about and dive into? You're a researcher naturally, so I'm sure you're going to get way into it and understanding and all of that. Like, have you identified any at this point that you really want to learn more about and how you can be a proponent?
Yeah. So how I've decided to go about it between now and the end of the year is there's a website called nationaltoday.com, and it has like all of the national days that you can celebrate. And so I looked at it to try to find between now and end of year, what are all of the concepts that are being celebrated that typically have stigmas around them. So one is the National Grief Day coming up. Actually, I wasn't as aware that there are stigmas around types of grief. So if you think about if somebody is lost because of drug addiction or suicide, there's more stigma around that and talking about it than someone who died of natural causes. And I was like, gosh, I hadn't really put that together as a stigma. So then that brings you into National Suicide Month is coming up. National Mental Health Awareness Month is coming up. And so while those are mainly on more the mental health side, I also want to explore what are all those other stigmas out there that I don't know. So while I'm going to celebrate those days and learn about them, I'm also going to be doing research on the side of, okay, what are the other, I think 9 to 11 stigmas that are out there that before this weekend, I couldn't even have told you that there were that many types of stigmas out there.
Yeah, I think if I sat here and made a list, I could rattle off, a couple of dozen that I'm consciously aware of. I'm sure that there's probably hundreds of others that I'm unconsciously aware of or just not present enough to recognize and be doing something to combat that. But there's a lot of worthy stigmas, and I say worthy of time and understanding to combat them, because I think there's a lot of good to be had on breaking some of that stigma, and it starts with just understanding the education of. So I applaud the time spent between now and the end of the year. And if there's anything that you're willing to share from that publicly, I think that'd be great. And I'm eager to learn.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm planning to put it all on LinkedIn, what my learnings are on a weekly basis. And certainly I'm going to be celebrating associations all over the place, because usually these national days or the tools and resources are provided by associations. So I'm super excited to really help the association industry by bringing some light to some of the great things they're doing to help abolish stigmas, but also help us learn about them. So I'll be doing that at the same time.
Again, I look forward to following that. I will be following you on LinkedIn. I do now. So look forward to seeing all of that. As we do, unfortunately, at the end of the show, we have to wrap up. But I would love to hear, Pauli, is there somebody in your network that would benefit our audience?
I do. I really appreciate many, many individuals. But certainly the name that I want to bring forward is someone that I feel is progressive, innovative, creative, and I just love brainstorming with him. His name is Bob Moore. He's with the American College of Osteopathic Family Physicians, and I would love to hear more from him because I enjoy any conversation I have with him.
That's fantastic. I look forward to speaking with Bob already. Maybe we'll just do a brainstorming session as maybe part of our interview, and you can help tee up some of the questions if you have some, Pauli. I'm always looking for good questions. So you know Bob better. I'd love to hear, what you'd want to hear from Bob, and we'll tease out some others as well. So thank you again, Pauli, for your time. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And I had shared, I look at these shows as a good book. If you can pull out one or two nuggets, I personally wrote down 3 or 4 and took some mental notes of others. So I thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience.
Excellent. It's been a badass podcast. Thank you so much.
There we go. Thank you, Pauli. Bye-bye.